Minnesota is at the center of what federal prosecutors are calling industrial-scale fraud, potentially up to $9 billion stolen from social services programs. Over 90 people have been charged, with more than 50 already convicted or pleading guilty. The numbers are staggering, but so is the political circus that's formed around it. Let's separate what actually happened from the partisan finger-pointing and identify what real accountability would look like. Here's what happened. Multiple Minnesota social services programs became vehicles for massive fraud schemes. The largest was Feeding Our Future, which allegedly stole over $240 million from pandemic-era child nutrition programs while claiming to feed tens of thousands of children who didn't exist. Then there's the Housing Stabilization Services Program, designed to help vulnerable people find housing. It was budgeted at $2.6 million annually, but exploded to $104 million by 2024, with prosecutors saying the vast majority was fraudulent. The fraud became so easy that two Philadelphia men literally traveled to Minnesota because they heard it was easy money. Prosecutors are calling this fraud tourism. Autism services saw similar patterns, with payments jumping from $1 million in 2017 to over $220 million in 2024, much of it now believed fraudulent. The program shared common vulnerabilities: low barriers to entry for providers, minimal documentation requirements for reimbursement, and virtually no verification systems. When spending increased by 2,600% in some programs, there were no automatic triggers for enhanced oversight. Now here's where it gets complicated. There's documented evidence that fraudsters weaponized accusations of racism to avoid scrutiny. When Minnesota education officials questioned suspicious invoices from Feeding Our Future in 2020, the organization filed a lawsuit with what federal prosecutors called unfounded accusations of racism. They explicitly warned that challenging minority-owned businesses would lead to racism claims sprawled across the news. The state backed down. Minnesota's own legislative auditor confirmed that threats of litigation and negative press hampered oversight. A former state fraud investigator stated there was a perception that forcefully tackling this issue might cause political backlash among the Somali community. This is real, and it matters. Bad actors successfully exploited legitimate concerns about discriminatory enforcement to shield criminal activity. That's a systemic vulnerability that needs addressing. But here's where the politicization comes in. The House Oversight Committee launched its investigation in early December 2025. Tim Walz was the Democratic VP nominee in 2024 and a possible presidential candidate for 2028. The committee's letter to Walz doesn't read like neutral fact-finding. It includes predetermined language suggesting he chose not to act for fear of political retaliation. Trump has made this intensely personal, repeatedly attacking Walz and making sweeping, inflammatory statements about Minnesota's Somali community, calling them garbage and claiming they contribute nothing. Treasury is investigating claims that funds went to terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab, but multiple federal investigators have told CBS there's no evidence of this. The White House is publishing blog posts about it. This isn't what oversight looks like. This is what opposition research looks like. And here's my concern. Politicized investigations can actually interfere with accountability rather than enhance it. When the focus becomes, what did Walz know and when did he know it, we're not asking the more important questions. Federal prosecutors are already investigating. State auditors are examining the programs. An HOC investigation demanding documents and testimony diverts resources while potentially adding little investigative value, especially if it's designed for sound bites rather than solutions. More importantly, when this becomes a partisan fight, Democrats feel compelled to defend Walz rather than critically examine what went wrong. That makes bipartisan solutions to prevent similar fraud in other states much harder. The conversation becomes Republicans attacking Democrats instead of how do we fix vulnerable welfare programs. So what should the focus actually be? First, how do we build fraud detection systems that can catch criminal schemes while remaining appropriately sensitive to discriminatory enforcement patterns? That's a real challenge that requires nuance. Second, why don't programs have automatic oversight triggers when spending increases by hundreds or thousands of percent? Third, how do we create verification requirements that balance fraud prevention with the need to get assistance to people quickly? Fourth, what's the right balance of federal versus state oversight for programs using federal funds? These are the questions that matter for preventing the next Minnesota. But they're hard, technical, unglamorous policy questions that don't generate cable news hits or opposition research. The fraud is real. The oversight failures are real. The weaponization of discrimination claims is real. But if the House investigation is primarily about damaging a potential 2028 presidential candidate rather than preventing future fraud, then it's not oversight. It's political theater that crowds out actual accountability. And that means the systemic vulnerabilities that enabled this fraud remain unaddressed, waiting to be exploited in the next state.